This is our last session today, and I'm really excited about this conversation. Which is going to be how multidisciplinary teams form a comprehensive approach to digitally derived endpoints. This is my only slide. We are going to have a conversation. There are no presentations. Hopefully it's going to be an engaging discussion. And in this case, we're really trying to understand what works, what is working for people in terms of how do they interact with colleagues in the digitally derived endpoint space. I found that the DHT field is quite disjointed. We've got teams that are really experts at different things, but they sit in silos. And if we're not talking to each other, we're not going to get to success. And so what I'm seeing, yes, and we've got our final panelist zoomed on in. What I'm seeing is that we need to listen with an open mind and work collaboratively. So we've put together this panel of people who sit in very different teams across different organizations. First, to share success stories where multidisciplinary teams provided the insight needed for a promising digitally derived endpoint strategy. And then also to share strategies for engaging with necessary experts to form a comprehensive approach to digitally derived endpoints. So I'm hoping that everyone will take away from this conversation how you can go back to your own organizations and talk to people outside of your teams, find common language or learn their language, and find common values that you're both striving for that will allow for teams to come together. So the granola is now stuck in my teeth, so this is really great. Please hold. All right, so I'd like to start with a panel here. We'll start with Tom. I'm really glad I'm not going to do much talking here. So can you give us a description, of course, who you are, but how your role in your organization intersects with DHTs across the organization?
Yeah, thank you. And I should say I'm a late stand-in, so I'm joining the team at the last minute, so I hope I can play a super sub role and add some value. So yeah, my name's Tom Willgoss. I'm from Roch, and we sit in a new team, which is quite relevant to this discussion today, which is a digital endpoints and patient-centered solutions group. And the reason I think it's quite relevant is we've taken a traditional patient-centered outcomes research COA team and joined forces with a digital health team, with an imaging team, and an AI team. So bringing together very unique capabilities under one mission. So yeah, day to day, this has now become a reality for us. We're very much a digital-first organization, whatever that means, and we can discuss that and debate that. But yeah, I think it maybe shows a signal of how the field is developing as well.
Great. Andrew?
Hi, I'm Andrew Potter. I'm an Associate Director of Biostatistics at Bristol-Myers Squibb, and I sit in the neuroscience therapeutic area, but working on primarily Alzheimer's disease-modifying therapies at the moment, but I'm also working a lot with our data science team and our kind of nascent digital health team to actually say, not only are we putting together the right evidence for developing these digitally derived, digitally measured endpoints, but also how do we actually get them into clinical development? Are they useful to the clinical development teams? And do the clinical development teams really have the tools they need in order to actually deploy these? So part of that is sitting with, sitting kind of on both sides.
I'm Liam Kaufman. I'm the co-founder of Winterlight Labs. So I co-founded Winterlight Labs in 2015, and we developed vocal biomarkers for use in clinical research. We are acquired by Cambridge Cognition in 2023. Cambridge Cognition makes computerized cognitive assessments, so I have sort of that experience both in vocal biomarkers and computerized cognitive assessments, and I lead product at Cambridge Cognition.
Hi, I'm Abby Newell. I'm a research director at Cancer Support Community, and for those of you who aren't familiar, we're a nonprofit that provides free psychosocial support for anybody impacted by cancer. We also have an amazing policy and advocacy team that works with regulators to support issues that matter to patients and caregivers, and I sit in our psychosocial research department, which is a multidisciplinary team of social scientists studying the cancer experience. We've collaborated with several industry partners on developing DHTs and incorporating the patient and caregiver perspective throughout that process. Most recently, we've worked on a project regarding DHT integration and work surrounding cancer cachexia. And so I'm excited to share how we can work together across organizations, including patient advocacy, to bring that patient and caregiver perspective to the forefront in DHTs.
All right, and Marie.
Hi, hello everybody, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but my name is Marie McCarthy. I'm a digital endpoint lead at Novartis, and I'm part of a specialist team at Novartis that support the use of DHT-derived measures across our drug development programs. And before joining Novartis, I've been part of DHT teams at a variety of different organizations, including a DHT vendor, a CRO, and now obviously a sponsor. And each role has kind of given me a different perspective into this kind of stakeholder mapping. And we're going to talk about that later. But, you know, it's been really helpful in my current role, which focuses on the selection and implementation of digital measures in drug development, really focusing on building that value-based strategy with respect to digital endpoints across a variety of programs.
Thanks, Marie. And I know you're on vacation, so especially appreciate you coming today, and Tom for being tapped at the last minute. We were going to have Jay Trudeau on the panel, and it's a bummer that he wasn't able to join us this year. One of the reasons I wanted to have this panel is because I was really inspired to hear Jay share that he's involved in, or was involved with the PCEC CHF working group, and he said, he shared with us in the planning sessions that the learnings from that working group he was taking back to his company and applying elsewhere. So CHF, cardiovascular, he was applying it to a completely different therapeutic area. And it was really interesting to hear how we can learn from each other and apply those learnings elsewhere. We don't just have to stay within our silos of therapeutic areas either. So wish he was here, but appreciate Tom filling in and having this entire comprehensive panel here. So it does feel like in the last year or so that the field is actually starting to make progress on DHTs. I can just kind of feel the enthusiasm going up. I'd like to hear from each of the panelists where the field is approaching this well and why do you think it's working? Tom, let's start with you, please.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can be controversial to kick us off. And I don't think this is a controversial statement really, but we're probably 10 years into our journey when it comes to, or maybe longer, digitally derived endpoints. And I think we probably had a pretty long period of this is a panacea that's going to fix all of our problems, just as we're experiencing now with the AI hype cycle as well. But it feels like in the last year or two, pragmatism has kind of come back to the table. And I think we've had some successes. I represent a company that worked on the 95% stride velocity for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which many of you know was approved and qualified by the EMA. But there's great work happening across the whole industry. And I think finally we're bringing the right people together at the table to do the right work. A couple of observations of where I think it's working particularly well. And this goes from a point where we wanted to do everything with a digital sensor to a much more purposeful attempt. So I think in early signal detection, there's a lot of really important work going on now where we can use some of these sensor-based technologies to make informed decisions on drug investments and medicine investments early on. And actually, that's a really good thing. It helps us to be much more efficient with how we develop our pipelines and to stop trials that are futile and to accelerate things that are looking really promising. So whilst that's perhaps not as cool, as sexy as many people would like to see as a use case, I think it's an area where we're seeing lots of success. Similarly, I think in the real world setting, using these tools to support decision making and monitoring of patients' own symptoms, again, it's a really compelling and valuable use case. Okay, it might not be a primary endpoint, but it does add value. And I think we're finally at that point where that pragmatic mindset is coming to the fore, and we're moving forward with the positivity I think that you're referring to.
Great, thank you. Abby, let's hear from you about where things are going well.
I think one of the places that we've had success and that we need to continue to invest in is engaging patients and their loved ones early and often in the development and incorporation of DHTs. And we've been lucky enough at Cancer Support Community to be a part of some of these multidisciplinary teams to bring the patient and caregiver perspective to the forefront and to be that linkage between lived experience and the experts who are running these trials and using DHTs. So in collaboration with industry partners, we've worked on bringing the patient and caregiver perspective forward for cancer cachexia, which is a complex metabolic condition that involves significant unintended weight loss, muscle loss, and it affects up to 80% of people with advanced cancer. This means intense fatigue, weakness, difficulty doing daily activities, and so it's a significant area of unmet need. And so we've been collaborating actually with industry, even in the preclinical space, before they were working on treatment for this, before they had even really identified the target. So we began in 2021 at Cancer Support Community by hosting a patient-focused drug development hearing for the FDA about what it was like to live with cancer cachexia, both from patients and their caregivers. And what came out of some of those early meetings was the intense fatigue, the intense weakness that really limited daily life and independence. And so then we went on to do a mixed methods needs assessment here at CSC as part of our research team about what that looked like, how that impacted daily life. And we continued then our collaboration with our industry partners and helping them design a patient preference study as well as for supporting work further for their FDA submission. And so what we've done well and what I think this models is the importance of engaging patients and caregivers early and then continuing to do that throughout the process, because when you lay that groundwork of getting the patient and caregiver perspective early, it helps ensure that when you're going to do a feasibility study, you're not completely off track years down the line. You haven't invested, for example, in a faulty clinical trial. And it demonstrates the importance of engaging with multiple stakeholders, including patient advocacy organizations and patients and their loved ones as well.
Thank you. Marie, let's go to you. Where is this going well?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Cheryl, I spoke about I was with the vendor previously, and I think back in the day, 2009, it was all about the tech. It was all about, oh, look, cool. What can we do with this? And actually, it's really amazing to hear. I mean, Abigail mentioned it, Tom mentioned it, where we've moved from the tech to the patient. And for me, that's a big step forward. There's a real maturing of the area. I think we look at kind of the implementation of biomarkers and PROs. They didn't really get credibility until we had kind of the best glossary. Until 2009, we had the PRO task force. And I think the guidances that have come out recently are really helping to kind of provide that backbone of evidentiary requirements. I also think another area, I'm part of an FBA working group. We brought out a paper 2 years ago about language. And I think when you have multi-stakeholders, when you have, patient-centered outcomes, when you have tech people, when you have data scientists, we need to speak the same language, because language matters. And having kind of a commonality, having glossaries, having people understand what we're talking about. So when I say validation, a data scientist has a completely different understanding of that term than somebody from the kind of the PCO piece. So again, I think having the guidance documents, both from the FDA and the EMA, seeing some progression. I think the stride velocity was a huge step forward. We had a phase 3 study. Now the drug failed, but actually having a primary endpoint in a phase 3 pivotal trial was such a huge advance because people in the space are really passionate. And so for me, I think we're at a cusp. We're getting to a maturity. We have guidance. We now understand the patient perspective is key in terms of digital endpoints. And I really am so positive about how things are going to develop in the future. I know people are impatient. Everybody's saying, oh, there's no primary endpoint. But I do think we're getting there. And I think there's another trial ongoing at the moment where there's a secondary endpoint derived from a DHT in a phase 2b3 program that everybody in this space is rooting for. And I think we just need to keep working to generate good evidence, to link it back to something that's important to the patient, and we will definitely get there. So I'm very positive.
Yeah, the language topic is one that's really been resonating with me, because even internally, I found when I joined CPATH that there was language that I used that other people didn't use, and vice versa. And right now, our quantitative medicine team and our COA scientists are working on a thesaurus, which instead of kind of saying, here's the definition for this term that you might hear this person use, it's more about, here's the common thing that we're all trying to accomplish, and here are the different terms that you might hear that are associated with that thing that we all share in common. So finding that common ground, and the language can sometimes be a barrier, and I think, the more description that we put around it, rather than just using kind of the buzzwords or the things we're really comfortable with, is helping to bridge that gap. Let's go back to the panel on the things that are going well. Liam, can we go to you?
Yeah, for sure. So DHTs can be super complicated. Like when we record speech, a 30-second sample can have 800 different characteristics, and it's difficult to figure out which ones we should focus on. And my background is more of a technical background, and so in the early years, we made a lot of mistakes, or I made a lot of mistakes. We didn't work with different groups of experts or patients like everyone is doing here. And I think one of the changes that I've seen, especially in the last year or two, is seeking consensus. So not just from different people in industry, but also patient groups. And I think that is really critical. Actigraph has done that really, really well, seeking that consensus. We're part of a bunch of different consortiums, and I think that's really critical to move the field forward.
And Andrew.
Yeah, Liam, you stole a little bit of my thunder, but I used to be at FDA, and one of the things I saw early on was people going, "Oh, here's these 800 measures or 300 measures or 60 circadian parameters. Oh, this one moved, so I'm going to select that," rather than going in and purposely saying, "All right, I have patients with a disease. These are going to be the certain maybe." Circadian when they fall asleep. Does that align with their local daytime? And does that matter to a patient? And then asking, how do we measure that, instead of saying, oh, we can measure circadian phase, we can measure all of these different circadian features, really shifting to a patient focused and saying, what are we trying to measure? Why are we trying to measure this? Then asking, how do we measure it? What are the technical solutions we can deploy to get there? And I think that's been a big change, a really positive change. And then when you go into a clinical development team, you can start to say, hey, we have this tool that allows us to measure what matters to patients for the drug, and we can do it efficiently, and we can tell you what it means. And that really that can really help in a discussion. Otherwise, they look at you and say, oh, this is nice and shiny, but why should I do this?
Yeah. So in our planning meetings, we just had a lot of fun with brainstorming, and I was so excited to get us together because they were really robust conversations. And we brainstormed some different metaphors for the digitally derived endpoint process, what it looks like, such as building a bridge from two sides that meet in the middle, or building a house on a solid foundation, one level at a time. And we kind of coalesced around the metaphor of a chain where each piece is forged strong and one weak link can break the whole chain. So I'd like to hear from the panel to talk a little bit more about this metaphor, or maybe your metaphor of choice if you want to throw something else out there, Tom. Tell us more about how this digital chain gets built with multiple stakeholders. Let's start with Andrew for this.
So I think I'm the guilty party with the chain metaphor, so I'll kind of start it. It came kind of as during the brainstorming, I was thinking a little bit about, well, when we're developing a drug, we always say, what's our indication we want in a label? And then we work, what are the pieces we kind of need to put together to get there, and how do we forge these links into a chain? I went, well, it's kind of the same thing we're doing with digital health. We want to say, we have a concept we want to measure. We've decided a digital tool, DHT is the right way to measure it, and we have a DHT-derived endpoint. How do we get there? Well, we want to know that it's fit for purpose. We have validation evidence, but to get there, it's going to take a lot of pieces. We're going to have to go in and say, is our technology doing what we think it's doing? Can we verify this? Can we then go in and do our analytic validation piece? What about our clinical validation piece? Are we going to run these in parallel? We have all of these different teams, different expertise, and we want to not only get a good solid piece, individual pieces, but we want to make sure they join together, that we have a way to join them together so we know that, okay, our valid verification, we've found out we're measuring what we think we measure, technically, that when we go and take that into a patient, that nice technical precision actually gets us to analytic validation, supports analytic validation, and maybe we're building those pieces in parallel. So how do we have to have good cross-disciplinary connection to make sure that when we go to forge it into a solid chain, we can do that, and that we don't have any gaps. And to go off the bridge metaphor, that, well, we actually do meet up in the middle, rather than we've got one bridge in Pittsburgh, one bridge in Cincinnati on the Ohio, and we go, wait, these are 100 miles apart. What happened? So.
Thank you. Marie, let's go to you now.
Yeah, no, I think that the chain analogy is a good one. I'm sorry I didn't come up with it, but no, it's an excellent one. But I also think, also building on the conversation that went on the panel before us, we can't create the chain every single time we have a study, and so having those links in the chain that are strong and can be used across other programs is really important. And Andrew was talking about that kind of that technical verification. We really do need, and that's the difference, I suppose, between DHT-derived COAs and other COAs, is we need to make sure the sensor is robust, that it actually measures. So if it's an accelerometer, have we tested gravitationally? Have we used a shaker plate? Is that there? Can we rely on the accelerometer to measure acceleration correctly? And then we kind of have that link, and okay, that's good. We can use that now across all of our programs. And then if we're measuring steps, have we done, is there evidence? And it's all about that evidence around, have we used a GoPro or have we used Observer, so that we can say this reliably measures a step. So that's those two links, and that can be used then in other studies. And then we go to the more kind of context of use in terms of, does you measure steps in that particular population? So we then go on to that kind of that meaningfulness, the kind of, that's the final bit, that clinical meaningfulness. So we're really thinking about building up those links in the chain. And I think it also means that, for those of us who've been in this area for quite a long time, technology doesn't always survive. Companies replace a model, but as long as we know what it was supposed to measure, if we can have a more agnostic approach, so we're not just dependent on a device, that was created 15 years ago, is going to be there all the way through to the clinical trial, the end of the study in the phase 3, we really understand what that link was supposed to measure. So we can start then swapping in and swapping out pieces of that link, but overall that chain is solid. I think I've used up the chain analogy, Cheryl. I'm not sure I can go any further with the chain analogy there. But, I do think it's really important to think about it in that piecemeal way, and being able to swap in and swap out pieces as needed, understanding the lifespan of a drug development program. Because I do think, if we're thinking about digital endpoints, we need to think about a program. We're not going to develop and validate a novel digital endpoint in a phase 3 study. We start way, way earlier, back in your phase 2A, your phase 1, and it evolves across. And if you just swap bits of the chain in and out, you need to be able to understand what that measure was and what that link was.
You're a good sport, Marie. I know the chain wasn't the one that you were necessarily endorsing. Marie spoke about the house where you build on that foundation, and I think what Marie was just sharing there is that you might develop and do all the technical validation in a different population, but it doesn't mean that you have to start from scratch. You can leverage that, and it's almost like, if we can connect it to the chain metaphor, that you've got a mold where you start with that mold. You might make that one link of the chain for this population, but it's the same mold that you can make a link for the new population. Let's go to Liam now, if you want to talk about chains or any other metaphors you can come up with.
I'm going to go rogue and choose a different metaphor. Puzzles. So I've actually recently become a puzzle nerd, so I thought it'd be appropriate to use that. When we first started Winterlight Labs, we did validation. So this is like analytical validation or clinical validation. And so we would show, to your point earlier, that 30 variables changed with like a PAN score or with like a CDR. And that was sufficient for some sponsors to use our technology in their trials, but it wasn't sufficient for everyone. And so I think each one of these, going back to links in the chain or pieces of the puzzle, whether it's concept of interest or context of use or industry consensus, each one of those is a piece of the puzzle that I think increases the odds that this technology will be used or adopted in clinical trials.
And Tom, you weren't in our planning sessions, so you have not publicly endorsed the chain metaphor yet. Would you like to comment on it, or maybe introduce something that I cannot pronounce?
Yeah, I'll throw something else out there. A slightly weird one, to be honest with you. So we've talked a little bit about siphonophores. I don't know if anyone knows what a siphonophore is. Google it. It's creepy. So siphonophores are living organisms that look like one giant creature, but they're actually made up of genetically identical individual living organisms that all perform slightly different functions. If you have kids, they may know about this because there's a show called Octonauts where they talk about giant siphonophores. But the reason I like it as an analogy is I think it illustrates that in a chain, often you assume that everyone's performing a similar type of role, whereas in siphonophores, you may be a particular organism that focuses on movement, or you may be poisonous, or you may digest, you may be a brain. So all the COA scientists are the brain, of course, and our other colleagues may perform other functions. But I think it's a nice way of thinking about a cross-functional team and how important it is to bring all those different skills together. But the other reason I like it as an analogy is siphonophores are really fragile. So they may be 40 meters long, but the width of your finger. And so it's very easy to break that chain. And I think in the current situation where we're moving into a more pragmatic, positive space for DHTs, we have to be really careful not to break that chain too quickly because we're still building trust amongst the different skills and capabilities. There's a long way to go. So yeah, Google it.
Spell it?
I didn't know there was a spelling test. It's Siphonophore.
Close enough. Let's hear from Abby now.
I think if we're thinking about the fragility of the chain or the siphonophore metaphor, one of the key underlying factors is that engaging patients and their loved ones has to be the adhesive, the glue, because this intervention will only be as effective as you've engaged and listened to patients and caregivers throughout it. And so if we want to solidify and strengthen the use of DHTs, we need to systematize the way that we engage patients and caregivers from the start. And that's one of the key weakness points that we can have when we're working across these cross-disciplinary teams. And I love the idea of focusing on a common language, not only with each other as scientists, as providers, but also with patients and caregivers, because a number, a circadian rhythm statistic, what does that actually translate to in everyday life for patients and caregivers? And I'll give an example from the work that we did in cancer cachexia. When we did our needs assessment, we found that things like being able to sit up and cook a meal and standing to cook that meal was a win for people with cancer and cachexia, as opposed to having to sit and have a stool in the kitchen or not even be able to cook the meal themselves. Then how do we take that incredibly meaningful activity of independence, of something that brings people joy, and translate that into something that we can measure with a DHT? Well, because we had worked in the preclinical space with our industry partner doing this needs assessment, we had that understanding and data to then be able to inform the process down the line. And so then that ensures that what's meaningful to patients is what we're measuring throughout the process.
That's awesome. Andrew, did you want to add?
Yeah, I was going to say we now have a kitchen as well as bathroom metaphors. But I was thinking about exactly during the previous session with bathroom, with bathing, all of that, how can we actually start to think of, could we actually use a DHT or some type of sensor to actually get it measuring this? Because, you know, sitting here being a parent of a 2.5-year-old, luckily not having any issues, but still it's, okay, all of the steps with the bathroom or with bathing, all of these things, and can we actually get ways of measuring that could be really impactful. So.
All right, so the question that I really wanted to get addressed on this panel for everybody to learn from is that I'm hearing that for the chain to bind together is that we need to get the right people speaking to each other and more importantly, listening to each other. And I know that doesn't always happen. So what advice would you, the panel, give to our audience on how they can get the right people working together on digitally derived endpoints? Tom, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And I think we're naturally seeing things evolve over time. So the different skills that are needed to bring these things forward, I think are coming out in the wash. And so we know how important it is to have good measurement scientists, to have techie folks, to have good data scientists, to have close engagement with patient communities. But I think the thing that often comes back is really being clear on what are we trying to achieve from the outset. And so the makeup of that team may differ depending on what we're trying to achieve. If we're focusing on signal detection, you may need a slightly different makeup of capabilities. And actually, perhaps some of the work that the measurement scientists do in the room may not be quite as important as some of the data scientists. So I think being really clear on the exact purpose of the work that we're doing is critical. I'm also seeing increasing pressure on everybody in terms of showing a return on investment as well. And in my opinion, if we can be really clear on what the return is from the outset, that allows us to bring the right people to the table. Because half the battle at the moment is things are popping up all over the place without a real clear vision on what we're trying to achieve, and often things fall apart and never actually meet the long-term goals. So I think return on investment is a slightly dirty topic, and it's come up a lot actually the last few days through the CPAF meeting, but I think if we get better at that, it allows us to bring the right people to the table from the outset, because people will buy in proactively.
Great. Andrew, do you want to share something?
Yeah, well, first I do want to agree with what Tom said, but a lot of it is, you know, if you get a little bit more into some of the details of what does each piece need to do. So I'm, you know, involved in a group at BMS where we're trying to say, okay, we have a measure deployed, we're collecting data in multiple trials. Now, how do we actually ingest that data, do something with it? And really, what are our clear goals from, you know, exploratory goals in this trial? Is it, you know, circadian rhythm monitoring? Is it physical activity? Is it ADLs? Or are we trying to look at all of these and, you know, talking to people on the database side, on the data science side, and trying to say, well, how do we build our database? Do we build a pipeline that does one thing well, or do we try to build a data pipeline, an analysis pipeline that is a little bit more flexible, that may be better for some of our longer term goals, but maybe less precise for our signal detection goal? You know, how do we start to balance some of those issues? And, you know, working with, you know, a computational neuroscientist, and then I'm coming in as, you know, clinical biostatistics, you know, with more regulatory experience. We had a conversation where he was talking about, well, should we construct the database we want to do our circadian rhythm analysis with our sleep data, or should we construct a database where we can do our circadian rhythm analysis, or if people want to look, if the clinical team and through patient involvement decides we need to look at total sleep time, can we very easily shift to that other measure? And how you build the database differs based off of what your goal is, and it really you have to before you can do that, you have to be really clear. What is your goal with your database? Are you going to submit this? Do you eventually think you're going to submit this to regulators, because that may change how you build your database, or is it going to be internal decision making, like go from phase 2 to phase 3 or phase 1 to phase 2? And if you don't have some of those clear at the end, you can't really define what your ROI should even be.
Thanks. How about Abby?
Yeah, I think one of the possible linkages here to get the right people at the table is to think about engaging patient advocacy groups. There are a lot of us who work in this space, whether it be disease specific or even those that are in measurement spaces and research standpoints. I think that we can be great resources, and we've seen that here today at this meeting already about the great work going on. A lot of us come from interdisciplinary backgrounds. I work on a team with epidemiologists, psychologists. Our policy team has amazing folks on the Hill. Our education team does plain language education. And we're plugged into other patient advocacy groups and other researchers and folks in the space. So I encourage everyone to reach out to patient advocates, because I think we can actually be a lot of this connective tissue in making sure that we have key players in each of these disease areas especially.
Liam?
When we first started to present to pharma companies, we were often presenting to digital health teams or machine learning or stats teams. And the people with those backgrounds would ask us very specific questions. Did you use tenfold cross-validation? Did you use support vector machines? It was very technical questions. And so we often developed the technology to meet those questions. And what I would advocate for is that there isn't a separate team that has very niche technical topics and questions, and that these teams are merged or integrated with the clinical folks or the patient advocacy folks or the COA folks that have a lot more experience developing outcome measures. I think there'd be a lot more benefits to doing that. And so this is something that I think we've seen more, and I've had a few conversations in the last few days about some companies that are already doing that sort of integration, so that you can combine those very disparate skill sets to take advantage of sort of these niche, difficult digital health technologies. And I think what I've seen too is that there's a lot of people that are interested in overcoming this barrier, that they want to see these technologies advance and recognize that they can't do it on their own. And so they have to work together with their peers across the company and with different companies as well.
And Marie, how are you seeing people come together?
Yeah, and Liam, I couldn't agree more with you. I mean, developing a digital-derived endpoint, it's no longer kind of a single discipline exercise. You really need to bring the stakeholders together. I mean, what I would say and what we try and do is we really try and start as early as possible. So, we look at the concept stage, we look at what is the measurement gap, and even to address that question, you need to bring multi-stakeholders involved. You need to talk to clinical teams. You need to talk to the engineers, the stats. And again, Abigail, to your point, really trying to engage early with the patient. And it's not just about making sure we're measuring what matters to them. We also need to address the question, that question about we're using a DHT. So is the device or sensor or DHT we're using, is it acceptable from the patient perspective? Are they willing to engage or utilize it for the duration of the study? So it's not just even, does the measure matter, but does the methodology for measuring the measure matter to the patient? That's alliteration. That's a bonus there for you, Cheryl. But you know what I mean? I mean, I think that's really, really, really important. And if we don't have that early alignment with clinical, with regulatory, with the patient, we end up having to redesign later when we suddenly are getting to our phase 3 and we suddenly realize, oops, it's not feasible to do this for 6 months and patients can't use the technology, or regulatory are now raising concerns that, the proper evidentiary requirements haven't been met. So for me, it's starting with that blank sheet of paper. Does this endpoint bring value? Is there a measurement gap? Because if there is no measurement gap, we shouldn't be using a digital endpoint in the program. If there are other tools that actually address the concept of interest in an easier or better way, that's what we should be doing. And we really need to think early, and we need to make sure that what is being proposed resonates and is aligned across the various stakeholder groups, and it's done early, and it's reassessed, and we check with patients, and we check with the clinical teams, and we check with our regulatory colleagues to make sure, because by the time you get to your phase 3 and you suddenly realize, oops, the patient actually can't wear these devices for that length of time, it's too late. So that Cheryl, would be my comment. It's having that multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder team that comes together, that looks at the measurement gap, that looks at that concept of interest, and makes sure that what we're measuring matters to patient and makes sense and adds value to a program.
Man, I love that point. I was just thinking as you were saying that, Marie, that we're filled in a sea of COA scientists and other experts here. In the COA space, we've got many different modalities that we can use to measure what matters to patients. We can ask them themselves. We can do a performance assessment. We've got different tools that we can pull out, including digital. But the digital folks, they have their digital tool, and they don't have necessarily a bunch of other tools in the toolbox. So it's kind of on us to be able to say, this is just one modality, and we want to be able to use it if it's appropriate. And if it's not, let's use a different modality, because what matters to patients is the thing that we're really trying to push forward, not trying to push forward a watch or something. We don't care about the watch. We care about what it's going to tell us. I saw some furious note-taking. Is there anyone that wants to comment on this conversation before we turn it to the audience?
Yeah, just one thing. I was just reflecting, and I totally agree with you, everything you've said. I think one of the things that we don't talk about is the need to be patient with this. We're all restless, and we all want to do things yesterday, but good science and good measurement takes time. It's iterative. And I feel like, for some reason, technology has almost given people an excuse to not do things in an iterative, scientific way. So it may be unpopular, but I think that's maybe a message that I would share with my stakeholders is it's not going to happen overnight. And we've been on a journey. That journey is continuing to help us learn. But I think a little bit of patience would actually go quite a long way in terms of moving the field forward rather than failing. But yeah, just wanted to add that.
Just to kind of build on what Marie said as well, I think there's a lot of excitement around DHTs potentially expanding access to clinical trials, facilitating remote trial monitoring and reducing patient burden. And for us, this is music to our ears. We want to make sure people have access to the best quality care. And, there's some data that DHTs used in clinical trials can reduce the number of appointments for people. This can be huge, especially in oncology, people with advanced cancer, right? Time is essential. It matters so much. It can also reduce travel, so reduce cost overall of care, and those are all promising advantages. At the same time, there are real challenges with scalability. We hope that this will make trials more accessible to people in rural communities, but if they don't have internet access so that the backup on the cloud isn't happening with the DHT, that's not going to be an option. If we're working with an elderly population, for example, that doesn't have high digital literacy, right, how are we actually training and facilitating that? And for our clinical staff, if they're having to spend hours teaching people how to do this, or if they're getting false positives, we've heard this with some remote temperature monitoring, for example, in the CAR-T space, that temperature monitors go off at night for no reason, and then people are in the hospital and stressed. Those are all real challenges that we need to take seriously, and listening and being patient with it, I think, is a great recommendation, because we want to be able to scale and make things more accessible, but we want to do it in a way that isn't creating more burden for the people and the users.
That's great. So we can open it up.
Sorry, I was just going to add one thing, sorry.
Please go for it.
No, one of the things I would say, and Abigail, you've probably seen that, sometimes you speak to people and they say, oh, no, we couldn't use them in my patient population, they're in their 60s. I hosted a very interesting work group at the ISPOR last year, and we had somebody in his 70s as a patient advocate. And he said some really amazing things. He said, you know, people of my age are willing to wear and use the devices as long as you explain to us what the purpose is and that they're easy for us to use. So I do think, you know, we as scientists and people in this space shouldn't underestimate patients' ability and their desire to engage in technology, as long as we explain what it does and we make it easy for them to utilize it. So I just, you know, I do think that's quite an important thing for us, not to make assumptions about what patients are willing and want to get involved with. I mean, the group that I work with, you know, are so enthusiastic about technology and they understand it. But that was his point at the you know, at his board, that, you know, yes, just tell me what it does, tell me the value, and make it easy for me to use. Sorry, Cheryl, for interrupting.
No, that's great. I'm really glad that you said that, because the word why keeps coming up over the last day and a half. It's not just what, it's why are we doing this thing? And that just underscored it right there. It's not just why are you submitting something for a regulatory decision? It's why are you doing this thing at all, and explaining it to the people who are going to interact with it. And that starts with patients. So we do have time for questions. We're going to stick with the one question per person rule, but I am going to break my rule from yesterday, which is if there are people who have done this successfully in terms of interacting with stakeholders that sit outside of your own discipline, and what advice you would give to the audience, you are welcome to share that. We've got a question.
Aspen Neuroscience. We deployed digital health technology in our phase 1/2A trial for Parkinson's cell therapy. It's a comment. So it's incredible to hear you guys talking. You have multidisciplinary teams. We did not have a multidisciplinary team. I would shout out to CROs. If you guys could start developing multiple disciplinary teams, that would be really helpful for startups. Because what's going to happen is that our trial will get subsumed into some other company probably, and we will have wasted time if we didn't do it correctly.
That is a great comment. Thank you for making that.
So Andrew, I'm a little disappointed you didn't actually say this one, but this goes with the why. Is the other theme that's come out and that hasn't actually been mentioned here is context of use. And when we're getting our 800 million parameters that your digital technology can capture, you're selecting one you think. The flip side is that we may have parameters that have been really extensively studied in a particular disease because it made sense for that disease. And its application may not make sense in a different context to use for a different disease. So I encourage people that if you're going to start to select parameters because it's been really well studied in one disease, but maybe not enough on yours and doesn't make sense, this is where the why comes into place. Does this make sense for your disease? Why is it this specific parameter and not something else? How does this make sense in what you understand in the natural history, diagnosis of disease? Because the reason it worked well in that one disease may not work well for you, and are you actually missing the right parameter then that way? So that's my comment on how the why is very important.
Thanks, Michelle. I can't see anything. These lights are too bright, so there is a hand here. I can see the shadow.
Thank you. This is Shannon from GSK. I guess my question is about correlations. When we have a DHT in a trial, what are we expecting to correlate with? Like anchor measures or biomarkers, you know, and what happens if the correlations aren't there?
I got this. So this is a topic that I feel passionate about. Often sponsors ask us to correlate our measures with gold standards. And it's a bit of a catch-22, because if we had a perfect correlation, why would you use vocal biomarkers? Why not just use the gold standard? If the correlation is not there at all, it doesn't really make sense to use, because maybe it doesn't work at all. And so you kind of want to get in this Goldilocks zone where like you correlate a bit, but not too much. And I think we need to move away from that And I think we need to focus on the context of use, the concepts of interest specifically. And so for vocal biomarkers, a concrete example is not seeing if we correlate with the ADAS-Cog, but do we correlate with symptoms that a clinician might observe, such as like word finding difficulties? So focus on something that this technology can do well, rather than just trying to mirror other gold standards.
I would add to that in kind of when we talk about looking at concepts of interest, it's really understanding what are you trying to measure? You know, what is the concept of interest that you're trying to measure? And so, you know, when you're looking at your study design and you're talking to your COA, your PRO experts and COA experts on the teams, that you're trying to make sure that there are other PROs or COAs in there that measure similar concepts. And it's not easy, but it's really trying to, like, it's going back to that fundamental question, what? So we've done the why. I don't know if we've done the how, but the what, you know, what are we trying to measure? And you really do need to try and ensure that you have other anchors in there to measure what happens. And I think that's, you know, in some respects, the PFDD guidance is really helpful. But I do think there are challenges, and Cheryl, I know you and I have had this conversation about kind of where this needs to go, is sometimes the digital endpoint measure is a little bit abstract, and it's hard to line up either domains that are similar, domains that are the same. So I do think that's probably an entirely different but it's not easy, but it's really, you know, understanding from the patient perspective, what are you trying to measure, and then trying to ensure that you have other anchors in the study that measure similar or the same domains would be my kind of perspective.
I guess we have our next panel session already planned out, and I feel like I feel like Liam and Marie stole my thunder. I was about to say the same thing. I don't even think that they should necessarily correlate, because, you know, I always use the MADRS and maybe some type of activity diversity measure in depression. You know, if we say our new measure has to correlate with the MADRS, well, all we're doing is recreating the MADRS. We're wanting to add information to the MADRS. We're saying the MADRS doesn't measure something well, therefore we need to develop this new measure. That means the information is probably going to be orthogonal to it. So I wouldn't even necessarily expect there to be much of any correlation as a statistician between, you know, a new digital measure that's capturing something novel in an existing measure. So then it leads back to, do we have the right tools, the right other measures in the study to actually capture what we're looking at? And then the other thing is, do we have to start looking at developing new statistical validation techniques that, instead of saying, well, we're going to say, are these two pieces of information related, say we have, extend some of our factor analysis, those ideas of a latent construct, and ask, is there some latent construct of disease severity that can be measured with the MADRS, can be measured with other PROs, that can be measured with the DHT, that everything's related to this underlying construct. Maybe we've got a couple PRO questions or PROs that relate to the DHT. Maybe they also relate to the MADRS. But sitting there trying to do this triangulation, squint at it, that doesn't really get us forward. We need to now say we've got more powerful statistical techniques. How do we start using them? And then how do we start getting those techniques to deal with the fact that we maybe have daily data? Maybe we have 6 DHT parameters that we think are related to our concept of interest. How do we, take advantage of how do we take advantage of and also handle the high dimensionality of DHT data?
And I'll add that as a psychometrician, we're already doing this with other COA types. So if you have a new PRO measure that you've developed, you're doing correlations and you're doing other correspondence sort of analyses, but you're not expecting perfection because you've hopefully created something that's better or serves a purpose. It might be better in that context. So it's really just building that validity story, and it's not a single correlation, but it's some looking at the patterns with other measures that you know things about, looking at anchors and known groups, which is my favorite term. I can't believe I just said that into the microphone. Known groups analyses, and doing it in different ways to be able to construct a story around it. And I know I hear it all the time. We want to see what correlation are we going to get, and is it going to allow for us to move forward with the DHT? If your colleagues are looking for a single number, they're going to be disappointed. So this is really where it has to go back into that evidence story, which I think we heard early yesterday in terms of what we're submitting to our regulatory colleagues, telling the story for what the numbers mean, rather than just looking at the numbers and saying we're done. Yes, we'll take this as the last question.
Hi, I'm Anna Cattleman from FDA. Yes, those are all great points, that it must be meaningful to the patient, it must be usable by a patient, it must be good for clinician to understand disease progression. But there is one factor, since we got into the anchor question, we need to understand the data that we're getting. And it's very important to understand the pitfalls of the device, because there are certain artifacts that could impact the values. So it's basically DHT is not a lab. And certain factors like temperature, like this room is terribly cold. And I'm sure that people who have CGM on have lower values right now, because it impacts the values that are being read by CGM. So these kind of things need to be thought through, as our colleague mentioned, that it's important to select the device early in development, but you also need to think about it. What are the artifacts of the device? And what could impact the reading and make them potentially inaccurate? Thank you.
Thank you for pointing that out. That's a really important chain link. I think Marie was alluding to that, but yes, we don't have that voice on this panel as the focus of the panel, and that is exactly why we have to be speaking to people outside of our expertise, because I know that is not my expertise, but there are people who do that on a daily basis, and I need to go find them for that early step. So we will wrap up now. I'd like to wrap up by opening it back up to our panel and asking each of you to share a call to action with the audience here so that they can play an active role in making the process of developing digitally derived endpoints more multidisciplinary. Marie, what's your call to action for the group here?
I would really encourage, of all of the areas I've worked in, I think DHTs is probably the people in the space are very, very passionate. And we do need that multidisciplinary domain expertise. And there were lots of different non-compete industry initiatives. Andrew, myself and Cheryl and others have been talking about kind of, meaningful change thresholds from DHTs. There's quite a lot of work to be done there. And we're not going to move this along unless we collaborate together, bringing our expertise together in that kind of non-compete. I think Cheryl, CPATH is a fantastic organization for bringing people together. There are others out there as well for those involved as sponsors. There's FPIA, there's Bio, where people are really trying to come together and passionately share non-competitive information and try and solution some of these things, like the meaningful change, like the meaningfulness to patients. And I would absolutely encourage everybody in the room to kind of, find that organization. DIME is a great organization, to find that organization and work with others to try and move the dial, because, I do think there's really amazing insights and information about that patient health experience that can be captured passively from the patient that can really help drug development. So I would encourage people to look and to seek out like-minded individuals and to try and solve some of the problems that still are questions rather than problems, questions that still remain.
Thanks, Marie. Tom, call to action?
Yeah, Google siphonophores, that'd be my first. I think we're quite tribal at times as in our niche, and I've observed that our colleagues who work in biomarkers can sometimes be quite tribal. And for me, that's been one of the friction points of the last decade. So I think maybe just reaching out and finding common ground with people who maybe think slightly differently to us, who follow different guidances, but are all working towards a same goal. So yeah, be less tribal, learn about siphonophores.
Spell it.
Andrew?
I guess I'm not quite sure how to follow that up, because I was going to say, well, I mean, I not learn about siphonophores, but that sounds rather cool. So now I'm going to go, oh, is there David Attenborough with that? But yeah, be less tribal, reach out. Also say, hey, what is your expertise and how can you bring something to it?
Thanks. Liam?
Don't just rely on the knowledge of your colleagues. Also learn. I think that helps you empathize with your colleagues and their viewpoints. It's never been easier to learn. There's guidance documents online. There's all sorts of information online that can help you understand different viewpoints and different areas of expertise.
And Abby?
I think one thing that Marie also shared today is invest in plain language, invest in explaining to people what DHTs are and what they're not. So explain that it's not tracking your location, for example, and that will help build trust. That transparency in community is essential to build trust, and that'll impact the uptake and success of your trial in the end. And also to engage and listen to caregivers and loved ones around, not just engaging patients, but I think we heard this loud and clear today, that there are multiple people involved in the success and the wellness of a patient and the success of your trial. So make sure that in that humility and that spirit of listening, that we're also listening to loved ones around them.
I'd like to thank my panel for joining us today and sharing this information with all of us. I hope that everyone has taken something from this conversation and can go home and make a new friend on the topic of digitally derived endpoints.